Conversations with Niki is brought to you by studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets. Well, welcome to Conversations with Niki, where we keep you entertained, informed and inspired. I'm Niki Seberini, and as always, it is an absolute privilege to be with you. I'd like to welcome our syndication partner listeners. That's Eldo's FM, Chai FM, Kawi FM, West Coast FM, MC 90.3 FM in Plettenberg Bay, Neisen FM, Wild Coast FM, and Bay FM. Also, just to remind you that every show is podcast, so please don't worry if you do miss part of it, or if you've missed any shows in the past. Just go along to the website www.conversationswithniki, that's one word, Niki spelled Niki.co.za, and the podcasts are there. Also, you can go onto the Facebook page, because I do put the link to the show on the Facebook page as well. So you can go to facebook.com/conversationswithniki, or you can follow me on Twitter, and I do tweet the podcast as well. And if you'd like to follow me, my Twitter handle is @Seberini. Wow, lots of housekeeping to work through before we get to the really interesting stuff. But without trying to be too depressing, and I think this is how I started the show last week as well, South Africa is a violent country. There is nothing we can do about it. It is the reality. We cannot ignore it. We cannot deny it. We just have to look at these ongoing service delivery marches that are taking place, and the violence happening, the xenophobia. I mean, just last week there was a road rage killing, a motorist killing a motorcyclist, and there just seem to be more and more people who are becoming more and more aggressive on the roads. Earlier this week, a man stabbed his fiancée and then took her dog and jumped in front of a truck. And this is just, three things that I've pointed out, and there are so many more. So we are bombarded, and it's there, and it is with us all the time. It is violent times. Today we're going to be looking at violence within relationships. We're going to be looking at abusive relationships. And when we talk about abusive relationships, we could be looking at physical abuse, we could be looking at sexual abuse, we could be looking at emotional abuse. And I have in the studio a man who's joined us before, and he really is so brilliant at explaining ideas and how things work, and then giving tips on how to get yourself out of a situation. And that is clinical psychologist Leonard Carr. So Leonard, really it's wonderful to have you in the studio again, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Niki. Thanks for inviting me.
And in a moment, in fact, I think we have Nishani on the line, Nishani Ford, who is going to be sharing her very personal story of finding herself in an abusive relationship when everything was closing down around her, and how she saw the light, how she followed the light, how she managed to get herself out of this abusive relationship and find life and find light once again. So Nishani, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be on the show with you.
So, Nishani, before we get to hear about your story, I just want to bring Leonard in right in the beginning to talk about, what is an abusive relationship, Leonard? Is it as hectic as, and is that how we define an abusive relationship when it gets to such a point when a man stabs his fiancée, grabs her dog, and jumps in front of a truck?
Well, I have a strict definition of that. I define abuse as any dehumanizing practices. Anything that makes someone feel diminished, less than, disregarded, unimportant, disqualified. When you take someone's voice away, when you take someone's right to stand up for themselves away, anything along those lines, no matter how subtle it is a form of abuse. So for me, abuse goes in degrees, and when you're talking about abusive relationships that end up in violence and murder, what you can be sure of is that they started probably as good relationships, and then the initial dehumanizing practices were very, very subtle, until the victim becomes so trapped and so conditioned into that dynamic that they get stuck, and when it escalates, they can't get out of it.
So I think that's why it's very important for people to really listen and don't discount the show and think, oh, well, I'm not in an abusive relationship because it hasn't reached that particular violent stage. I think that we need to identify where we are in a relationship. And you spoke about the dehumanizing. You spoke about not having a voice. And I was reading up a whole lot of information that you sent me. Something as little as telling your partner what they can and can't wear, who they can and can't be with, what is appropriate to say. Yeah. But I mean, I'm just wondering, Leonard, how many people listening here, without even realizing that they've given up so much, are in that state already?
Think about telling someone they're being hypersensitive. When someone expresses their needs, calling them demanding, nagging, or whining. Think about children at school. Put up their hands and ask to go to the bathroom, and they're told to shut up. Get in your place. Anything that takes away someone's voice, that doesn't allow someone to express themselves. When you talk about clothes, that's expressing your taste and your identity. But it can be expressing your feelings, expressing your opinions. Maybe you are complaining. Maybe you are dissatisfied about something. Not allowing someone equal right to say who they are, what they need, what they feel, is a dehumanizing practice.
Leonard, people who are responding to what you're saying right now, I don't want them to turn around and go, oh, well, I'm out of this relationship because this is an abusive relationship. Should they be looking at themselves? Should they be looking at, how do I find my voice again?
Well, look, all interactions
I'm sorry, I'm only saying it because we're looking at the extreme, which is the violence. But I do think there are many people who are in that state where they don't have the voice and they don't realize it.
All interactions are a negotiation. And they're not only a negotiation about the issue that you're discussing, they're a negotiation about the relationship. Who gets to be in control? Who gets to have a voice? So, for example, if someone spills their drink on you, and you say, oh, don't worry, it's probably my fault. You've negotiated yourself out of power in the relationship. You've already told them, you can basically step on me and I'll take the rap for it. So people have to be conscious all the time of how they're being treated in relationships. And in general, people are quite selfish and tend to push the boundaries. So every person has to take responsibility, and children have to be taught to know where the boundary is and defend yourself at the boundary. And when you are attuned to subtle boundary crossings, someone interrupting you, someone putting you down in a subtle way, or disqualifying your opinion, by saying, who the hell are you to talk, or whatever it is, if you call it there, then usually through subtle adjustments you can avoid the relationship becoming abusive. And if you find the person doesn't listen and escalates their attempt to put you down at that point, then you leave. The trouble is, and particularly with women, they tend to take the blame, take the responsibility. It's got a lot to do with how they're socialized. Smile and be pretty. Don't be too demanding because men won't love you, that kind of thing. So the woman tends to think that if I'm nicer and if I'm more easygoing, then the politics will change. And actually what happens is they give away their power, and eventually it's too far gone to change.
Okay, so this is interesting. You talk about it being a negotiation, and there are two people who enter into a relationship. So if this person enters into a relationship and they say, don't worry, it doesn't matter if you spilt that drink on me. You've said they've sort of laid down an invisible rule or a boundary.
Exactly.
They've said this is where the boundary is. So can we say that that has something to do with that person's self-esteem? If that person is in a relationship with any person, they would interact or enter that relationship with that same energetic demand.
So I'm very, very scared of the whole self-esteem story, because it can end up blaming the victim, and I never, ever blame the victim. One has to realize that all relationships are about power. And people don't like to hear that, but there's always a power dynamic in a relationship. And a respectful relationship, a caring, loyal relationship, is a relationship where people choose to manage power in a way that makes space for both of them. And when that subtly starts shifting, or sometimes not so subtly, then the power balance shifts. And some people don't know how to stand up for themselves because of their relationship to power. It's not about self-esteem, it's about how you relate to power. Some people are comfortable with power, some uncomfortable. Some people are happy to claim their own power. Some people are fearful, especially women, that if they claim their power, they'll be rejected. So they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Because if I stand up for myself and I claim my power, I run the risk of being rejected. On the other hand, if I give my power away, I'm going to be abused, which is rejection anyway. And so that is a very disabling dynamic for someone to be caught in.
So to find yourself in a relationship with someone who is wielding his or her power in a very, very strong way, whether it be emotionally abusive, sexually abusive, physically abusive, how do you negotiate yourself out of a situation like that?
Well, as I said, the earlier you pick it up, and if you start when those subtle boundary crossings happen, it's much easier.
Okay.
By the time you're in frank abuse, it's very, very difficult. But I'll give you a very simple...
So it grows slowly. This is what you're saying.
Definitely, the politics shifts slowly, and the one person takes more and more power, and the other person, in the belief that it'll solve the problem, gives away more and more power. But at the end of the day, the simple rule is that if you call someone and they are prepared to take the feedback and they respect you and they modify their behavior, fine. If you can't confront someone, you only have one other choice, and that's to leave. There's no middle ground. And that's what people have to realize.
But this is where it's very difficult, because there's so many other aspects involved here. And that's why we have Nishani on the show today, because she's going to be sharing her story and just talking about, at what point do you have the strength to end it? Do you see those warning signals right at the beginning and say, oh, how many people have the strength because they have hope and they love this person and they think, I'm sure it's going to come right. So when do you have the strength to do that? So Nishani, I'm going to bring you in here because, you had the most wonderful upbringing. Your father was a fantastic role model. There was love. There was communication in your family. There was nothing aggressive or abusive in your upbringing.
Yeah. There was nothing aggressive or abusive in my upbringing at all. That's so true. And I agree with Leonard. It is a power thing. And if you can get out when it's in subtle abuse, it's wonderful. And in retrospect, I can see when I should have gotten out. I should have gotten out the first time he verbally abused me when my baby was 6 days old and I brought my baby home from hospital. But I didn't. I didn't because somewhere inside of me, he was the father of my children, and I was hoping that he would, that he would change, that he would, he was going to anger retreats, going to a counselor, trying to work on his temper, and I was a wife who was going, actually, I want to make this work. I wanted to give it another chance. But I like to use the analogy of the frog in the boiling water. If a frog is in cold water and it slowly starts to boil, you don't notice how hot that water is till you're almost dead. But if you put a frog straight into boiling water, it will immediately jump out because it knows. And that's what happened over the years. So slowly, I gave away my power to him in the hope that he would, that he would change. I gave away my power to him in the hopes that things would shift in our relationship. But it didn't. It became more and more aggressive over the years until it became financial abuse, emotional, sexual. It just spiraled. And I can see it in retrospect. But in the time that it was happening, all I was doing was trying to save a marriage, not even identifying it as abuse. But as a man who had some demons that he needed to work through, and as me being the supportive wife, trying to help him and stand by him. Yeah.
Leonard, what were you going to say?
You see, I would say that how a good upbringing predisposes you to abuse. Because everyone likes to think that people who are abused had some kind of abuse in their background. But how a good upbringing predisposes you is you find that people who've been brought up in loving homes see a negative behavior and they think it's just a rough edge, and with a little bit of love and everything, you'll rub off that rough edge. And the message that I would give to people is those rough edges are actually just tips of icebergs. You know, and you know, when someone's rude to you or hurtful in the way you described, a person who comes from a healthy home will say, inevitably this person's going to feel guilty, feel remorseful, and change his behavior. You haven't actually had the experience to realize that there are actually bad, nasty people in the world.
Yeah.
So you were just looking for the good, Nishani.
I was just looking for the good. Not once did I ever say that he was a bad or nasty man. In fact, I covered that up socially because he was leadership in our church as well. So, you know, we had this facade that we had to portray.
And I would go so far as to say that even attending anger management workshops is part of the facade. It's just an alibi to pretend that you're taking responsibility while you carry on your abusive behavior.
Yes.
Nishani, when you first met him, because I know that you were on a missionary, you know, you were on a boat and you met him and it was love at first sight. Were there any telltale signs? I mean, you talk about abuse starting just after the birth of your son, but before that, anything, outbursts, how could you identify it in his character?
No, you know, we had this whirlwind romance, and maybe that was the sign, because our first year of marriage was utter bliss. It was so blissful. And we had this whirlwind romance, absolutely nothing. So the first time he verbally abused me, I was in a state of shock more than anything else. You know, and I wondered, like, what just happened? Oh, he just had a moment, you know? So, yeah.
Well, you heard Leonard talk about the, you know, sorry I spilled my drink on you, and the person responding saying, no, there's no problem. When that first abuse did take place and you thought to yourself he had a moment, did you put your stick in the ground? Did you show him? No.
In fact, one of the things that I've always told my children is that the first time you find yourself making an excuse for someone, a big red light should be going off in your head.
Wow.
And you know, in hindsight, I see that, because the person I was before the relationship and the person I am today would not tolerate this for a minute. In fact, in my relationships now, I'm very upfront and clear. So I'm very aware of those subtle signs. And if a person wants to go, then they're free to go, you know. But you know, being sort of coming from a closed community, one where women are almost treasured and taken care of by their husbands, it's also a culture issue, you know. So that also plays a huge role in an abusive relationship.
Absolutely.
Because there are certain things you don't talk about. And I just couldn't talk about it to anybody.
Well, that's what you say, Leonard. You talk about it being such a patriarchal society that we still live in, and this is a huge problem.
Absolutely, but you can also see one of the things that makes it difficult to leave is that every abuser isolates the victim.
That's true.
You know, and that's what we're hearing. Is once you can be isolated by shame, that you're too scared to tell anybody, or too embarrassed to tell anybody, or it feels like a failure. Or you can be isolated because the abuser says, you know, this one's rubbish and that one's a bitch and that one's terrible and you shouldn't be talking to your mother, and you become too fearful to talk to anybody.
You become very fearful to talk to anybody, and what happens is that you start to believe what they say. So I started to believe whatever my ex-husband said to me. And because I had no other voices around me, his voice became the voice of reason and logic, and it was the only voice I heard. So, you know, then I completely isolated. But the isolation, I think, is the most dehumanizing thing, because before you know it, nobody's visiting, you don't have friends over. You know.
And then, of course, when he says you're worthless and no one's interested in you, you have evidence that makes that a very compelling argument.
You have evidence, and also, it's absolutely true, because then suddenly you realize, oh, actually, nobody actually hangs out with me. Yes, it's true. You know?
Were your family concerned, though? I mean, did they approach you and say, we're worried? I mean, I know that financially you were struggling because he was just not working all the time. So there's something that's very obvious that you can see when someone's struggling there. But did they realize that something else was happening? They did.
Yes, they did. They did try to get me out several times. but I wouldn't listen. I just wouldn't listen because, his voice was the voice for me. He was the love of my life, father of my children, and I believed him more.
You see what sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I don't want to interrupt you.
No.
But you can see that abuse is a theft of power.
Yes.
And that's why the abuser is usually the inadequate one, and the victim's usually the competent, powerful one, which is what makes it confusing for everybody.
That is.
Because no one understands why can't someone who's actually more successful be the one who leaves. But because it's a theft of power, it also locks you in because you want to turn it around in order to get your power back. There's a feeling if I've been disempowered, only by proving that I can get this right and I can restore this relationship to normality, that I can get my power back and vindicate myself. So it's a bit like a gambler who's on a losing streak and you just can't let go of the table because you want to get your money back to vindicate the fact that you've been gambling all this time.
Is that how it felt for you, Nishani, that you just wanted to make it right?
I just wanted to make it right. And, I was powerful in every area of my life. I mean, I was an executive in a large organization, and I was being abused. So I had all this power, decision-making mandates at work, and I would come home and be fearful. So it's also the fact that I didn't want to fail at this. So it's not like failure for me.
No, absolutely. And Leonard, I want to ask you, because you spoke about two things. I mean, we spoke about controlling in terms of what you're wearing, who you're hanging out with, isolating you. It's this power game. These abusers in relationships, I mean, is this something that they consciously plan? Is this something that they're thinking about all the time? Or is just this the natural flow of when people are trying to win the power in a relationship?
Well, do any of us plan the way we relate? It's just well-practiced behaviors that they've been doing since they were small. They're expert at it. One of the reasons that it's so difficult to beat them at their game is because it's someone who's never played chess before, going against an international chess master. They've dealt with every kind. They're like salespeople who've dealt with every objection. They know every move you're going to make, and they've already got 3 counter moves. So you actually never feel, they're like Teflon coated. You never feel that there's anything you can do or say that's going to stick in some way.
And I think for me, the worst thing was that we did go for marriage counseling and all of those kind of things. But he was so, I don't know, crafted, manipulative, or intelligent in this way that everybody thought I was
the problem.
I was the problem.
I guarantee you, he said that everything was 6 of one and half a dozen of the other.
Yeah. And, he made it out to be so much so that I was ostracized from many people after I left him because they thought that I was the problem.
Yeah. When I deal with an abusive relationship in practice, I tell them up front, we're first going to discuss the issues of power and abuse.
Yeah.
And that's going to be not even-handed. I'm only going to talk to the abuser. And if we can get that right, then we're going to talk about the other things in the relationship. Because as soon as you talk about abusive behaviors and then he says, yes, but you're not a great cook, you can see that that's trying to minimize the abuse and amplify minor everyday things as if, that justifies the abuse and equalizes the responsibility on both sides.
So, and also, as we grew, so we started to grow apart, boundaries got so blurred. Boundaries were just absolutely blurred. So, I became almost a prisoner in my own home. I didn't have freedom or safety in my own home.
What do you mean by that, Nishani?
It meant like that he would lock me out of the house, for instance, in winter, with sort of so he wouldn't hurt me, he wouldn't hit me, but he would lock me out the house, or he would suddenly say something to the children that made them think that I was not a worthy mother. And if I became emotional, then I was weak. And he said, "Oh, look how weak your mom is," that kind of thing. And I had no place, even my home, and my children didn't know who I was.
How did your sons respond in this situation? How were they?
So my sons were that was a turning point when he had a knife to my throat, and my son was 10 years old, my older son. And he had a knife to my throat, and I looked at the corner of the eye, and I saw these two boys cowering in the corner. And I thought in that moment, I am going to die in front of my children. And that was a defining moment for me, because when I looked at their faces, they just looked helpless, you know. So my sons are still struggling. They still don't have a relationship, a healthy or any kind of relationship with their father. And it was tough. The first 3 years after the divorce, I had to teach them how to treat a woman. I had to take them on dates. I had to show them how to talk to me, because they had certain ways that their father would speak to me that they thought was acceptable. So it took almost 3 years of consciously every day dedicating ourselves to teaching them how to treat me and setting their boundaries. But it was tough, because it was about taking my power back, not just as an abused wife, but as a mother and a parent and a head of the home now, you know.
And Nishani, so you said that was a turning point for you. Was it? Did you there and then turn around and say, "That's it, I've had enough, I'm leaving," or did you have to do it slowly? Because I can imagine that in a situation like this, you're terrified. You're terrified to bring that up in case it brings out more rage.
You know, you're so scared. I wish I could say I just walked out and it was hunky-dory. I wish I could. It took me 3 years to leave him, because financially I had to get out my feet. I had to build a case because I wanted full custody of my children. I had to lay some reports at the police station, you know, and I had to get financially on my feet. And also because I had ostracized myself from my family due to this marriage, it was hard to ask for help. So, it took me 3 years of planning to leave him.
Nishani, I would say that 3 years is actually very quick.
Is it, Leonard? Really?
Compared to most women in abusive relationships, 3 years sounds very organized and very decisive, given the circumstances. Because I want to add,
I think 3 years is a lifetime. Why does it take so long?
It is a lifetime. One of the things that keeps you trapped, and I'm sure Nishani can relate to this, is that abusers keep changing the rules.
Yes.
And the main method of disempowering people in an abusive relationship is to make the person doubt their own experience, doubt their own thoughts, doubt their own feelings, and whether all of that is valid or not. So that means, for example, switching from being nasty to charming, or from being abusive to remorseful. And also changing the rules where something they won't react to on one day will cause a blow up the next day. So the victim ends up being totally dependent on watching for subtle cues in the person, like the child of an alcoholic. Has the person been drinking? They can hear from the way the door opens, from the footsteps, from all of those little cues. What kind of a night are we going to have tonight? Is this going to be an angry night or a peaceful night? So you end up being totally dependent on the other person's next move to decide your internal world and your behavior. And that is a very powerful form of keeping someone imprisoned.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said it was a prisoner, because it felt like I was walking on eggshells. And I mean, and I'm going to be very open, I mean, some of the sexual stuff, I would just be quiet so that I wouldn't wake the children or wouldn't cause a riot in the middle of the night. It would upset the entire household. So I put up with a lot of the abuse sometimes because I was so scared. I didn't know what his next move would be, you know?
But also from the sexual side, when you've been degraded and humiliated, you don't feel worthy to claim your power. So that's also a very powerful way of disenfranchising someone. Yeah.
And especially, I think, that, you know, if there is a sexual interaction without intimacy at all, you know, then one is even more disempowered, because it made you feel even more sort
used
of
and objectified.
And objectified like an object, you know. So here I was, powerful in the boardroom, and I had a totally different life, which was even more difficult because I had to wear this mask every morning, you know.
Nishani, stay with us. We're going to take a break. We're going to continue because, of course, there is light at the end of this tunnel. And I just think that there's so many people who are listening right now and can relate to what you're saying, and we need to move forward, and we need to look at the strength that you found and how you were able to find that line. So we're going to take a break. Please do stay with us. We're going to be right back.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is S.V. Prinsloo, and I'm the HOD of IT Integration at Bridwin Preparatory School in Melrose. We started using study apps about 6 months ago and have seen astonishing results. We were quite amazed to see how quickly the kids have been able to use study apps and the benefits it has shown with regards to reinforcing what they've already learned inside the classroom. I would highly recommend study apps for any school.
Studyapps.co.za. Well, if you've just tuned in, welcome. It's Conversations with Niki. I am Niki Seberini, and this, of course, this is the show where you are entertained, informed, and inspired. Welcoming our syndication partner listeners, that is Bay FM, that's Wild Coast FM, Neisner FM, MC 90.3 FM in Plettenberg Bay, Kawi FM, West Coast FM, Eldos FM, and Chai FM. And we're having such an important discussion today, especially with our clinical psychologist, Leonard Carr, pointing out, what is abuse in relationships, and just realizing that there may be many people out there who are in an abusive relationship and don't fully realize how much of their power they've given away. They think that that is how it is supposed to be in a relationship. And this show is really about taking your power back and moving forward. And I have Nishani Ford, who's been sharing her story of falling in love and having her hopes and dreams shattered slowly over the years. It didn't happen immediately. This was a love at first sight, very passionate relationship, and it turned sour and it turned bad over a period of time. And Nishani, as I said just before the break, so many people listening can relate to what you've been through, and perhaps many of them are where you were before you decided to have that 3-year plan to get out of that relationship. But there's a lot of it's all very well, to say you had to plan financially, you had to get everything right, you needed to lay charges at the police station, and those are all physical things that you could do. But what about mending yourself? What about healing yourself so that you could become a full, functional person, emotional person, not just the person in the boardroom, but an emotional person?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that really shifted me was engaging with a coach. Mm-hmm. I was asked to be a case study for a coach who was doing her qualification, and she then took me on a 6-month journey on exactly what Leonard is speaking about. How do I get my power back? How do I start deciding what's best for me in my own life? Not even, with the facet of the children, but putting myself first, even before the kids, And so it was that. It was a few things. There have been many people. Angelique Dutoy is one of those individuals who invited me to a breakfast one morning, and, the one thing that she says, you have choice. And I had never realized that I had choice in this whole, situation. And then it was that I decided through that process that I would change careers, that I would actually then go and go back to university, go to UCT and become a coach, a life coach and a speaker, and actually start following some of my own dreams. And so it was a 4-year journey. It was waking up at 3 in the morning to study. It was study blocks 5 days at a time. And, I remember the one weekend trying to organize my children, and it took 11 people to coordinate everything that I had done, everything that I do, So I went back to school. I continued to work, started to drop the mask and did some really deep work. There's, I have a principle that I live by, and it is don't wear your wishbone where your backbone ought to be.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Good one.
I love that. I'm going to write it down. Don't wear your wishbone where your backbone ought to be.
Because I knew that, he doesn't support me financially or the children. And I knew that I would need to be able to stand up on my own 2 feet. And I wasn't going to compromise the life anymore. I wanted life. Because my kids didn't know who I was. And I wanted them to see me passionate, excited about living. And
these changes that took place, were you still in the marriage when they were taking place?
No. I was some of it was when I started studying. I was still in the marriage, and by the time I'd finished, he was out of the marriage by then. Yeah.
Now, I know that you had a very difficult time with your one son,
Yes.
and he started experimenting with drugs.
Yes. He started experimenting with drugs at the age of 11 years old. He went missing when he was 13 years old. And when I found him, he sat on the bed and he said to me, "Mom, please help. I'm a heroin addict."
At 13.
At 13. And so we began a journey. I mean, we're not there yet. We're still in recovery. You know, it's a lifelong journey. But what that has opened up now is that I do community work with the government in Soweto and Eldorado Park, Mamelodi, doing community work with addicts. So I specialize my coaching into addiction recovery, and I've built an entire business and community model around that, which is now actually getting some attention from the powers that be in government.
Geez, that's so important, Nishani. That's really important.
Yeah.
I have to ask you the question though. You spoke about spending time with your children and
Yes.
teaching them to treat a woman properly because they'd only seen an abusive interaction between a father and a mother. But were they angry with you? And
Absolutely.
how were you able to work through that? I mean, how do you? It's you can talk about this is not an appropriate way to communicate, but how do you go underneath that so that they can really connect with you and feel that trust and love with you again?
You know what? The boys were really angry. In fact, some of the words were really harsh. You know, they blamed me for choosing their father, for marrying him, and then he became Disney dad when he was gone, because they romanticized him. So I was the mom setting the boundaries and the rules, and suddenly he was gone, and he became Disney dad. So it was about being truthful. It was about asking for help when I needed it, because now I speak so freely about this to everybody I can. So what I've done is I've built a network of support that's just incredible around me. And the boys and I have really robust, open conversations. And I think for me, the coaching concept has really helped me because it's changed the way I parent them as well. So we don't deal the issue, we deal what's actually happening here.
Yeah. What do you have to say about that, Leonard? About children witnessing abuse?
Obviously,
and finding your power and how you bring the children into that play.
There's obviously a huge amount that can be said about this. One, depending on the child's gender, and depending who the victim is and who the abuser is, the child's feelings about themselves. For example, for a boy to watch their father abusing their mother, their relationship with their own aggression, with their own male sexuality and all of that is going to be compromised, because either you identify with the abuser or you reject the abuser, but then you're rejecting part of yourself and end up with conflicts about your own sexuality and assertiveness and all of those kinds of things. And then also the ambivalence towards the mother, because on the one hand you feel like you need to protect her and rescue her, and on the other hand, for a child, there might be resentment that you didn't protect and rescue me. So there are all of these issues, and I think one of the solutions for children is to actually help them to identify what they value and appreciate about themselves, and to get a positive picture of their own qualities and talents and skills in relationships, and then trace those to both parents, and come to a point of gratitude where they can look at each parent and see what each parent contributed to those qualities, some of which might be in terms of learning not to be that way. Where you can be grateful for what someone actually taught you, and you can be grateful to them for showing you how not to be. And when children can reach that point of gratitude, appreciating themselves and their parents, they can make peace with all of this.
Nishani, and yourself going into relationships, I mean, you've said that you're very upfront, but what was that like, seeing another person and being able to trust another person, being able to open your heart, being able to trust yourself?
It was, look, it's scary. It's not without its fears, but it's like, I'm going to look this eyeball to eyeball, or I'm going to sweep it under the carpet. And I always have a choice. So even when I'm a bit afraid, I still look at eyeball to eyeball. I'm not afraid because I've learned how not to give my power away. You know, how to negotiate the power dynamics in a relationship so that neither party is dehumanized. And I think for me, that takes away the fear.
Leonard?
Yes, I think what makes it very, very scary for anyone who's been in an abusive relationship is that abusers are never just abusive. They both. And all abusive interactions start as loving interactions. So because the loving interactions slowly shift subtly into abusive ones, the victim loses trust in her own ability to discern what's a truly loving relationship and what's just a ruse that's going to end up being abusive. And, you know, this even applies to children who've been abused. People who, for example, molest children always start in a loving, nurturing way. And so the child never learns what the difference is between those behaviors from someone who's exploiting you and someone who's really loving you.
Is that hard for you, Nishani?
That's very true. I think that you have no concept of what a normal, loving relationship is. And it takes a lot of open communication and a lot of saying, I'm not comfortable with this doesn't, you know, sit well with me. I'm scared and I know this is my stuff. You know, so it takes a lot of communication, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Nishani,
and also knowing what's my stuff, because I mean, you know, if it's something, it's like I can't blame the person I'm in a relationship with now for stuff that my ex did. So it's like knowing that it's my baggage, being aware of that, you know,
and moving forward. So, I mean, you go and you speak to people, as you say, you look at abuse, and you're looking at addiction, and you're helping so many communities and so many people. But Nishani, for those who are listening and who are inspired by your story, and maybe you're in a place where they want so to be, what do you have to say if you had to leave us with something that really that could make an impact?
Don't wear your wishbone where your backbone ought to be. No. Yeah. You know what I would say? I would say never think that it's your fault, firstly, and just start. Because it's overwhelming to think, how am I going to get out? How am I going to, you know, make it on my own? How am I going to do this? But if you just start somewhere, you're better off than you were if you had not started.
Nishani, thank you. Thank you so much. I know you're about to board a plane. You're on your way to travel somewhere. So, you know, for your time today, for your shared story and experiences, and reaching out, whether you realize it or not, to so many people and helping them. So I thank you very much for that.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Nishani Ford, just sharing that story. And Leonard, I just find it so interesting. I mean, when you're talking about the kids and you're talking about the relationship, I think is it something that you can ever really put away in a cupboard and close that cupboard door and move on? Because it's always going to haunt you, isn't it? It's always going to, there are always going to be triggers.
They're always going to be, because I think you're in a way, it's as if your instrument panel, what you use to negotiate the world with, you know, how you understand other people's behavior and your own behavior and how you make sense of reality, all that's been scrambled. And so now you have to unscramble it, and you're never quite sure whether you've unscrambled it fully or not, because what influences our behavior most is actually habit. And that's why if you can condition someone, for example, into being a victim, it's very easy to keep them trapped because it's hard to break a habit. And so it is really a lifelong thing. And also, because relationships are a constant power struggle, once people become attuned to that, even when they've dealt with the issues of abuse, you know, like Nishani very well highlighted, then you realize you have to be negotiating needs and feelings and boundaries and rules in relationships all the time to keep them healthy. And this is why my passion is actually how to teach children to do this, and how parents have to, and teachers have to ensure that children are inoculated through protecting their power and their voice. For example, if you say to a child, kiss granny, or kiss your uncle, and the child's reluctant to, you're breaking a boundary. You're telling the child to override an instinct. If you tickle a child and the child says stop and you don't stop, you're shifting you're disempowering the child. You're taking the child's voice away. If a girl gets angry and you say it's not ladylike to get angry, but it's fine for a boy to get angry, you start switching off people's ability to discern, to feel, to discern intellectually, feel emotionally, and behaviorally protect their boundaries. And that's why we've got to start from the time a baby is born, respecting their voice, being present to their needs and feelings, not judging them, calling children a nag, shutting them down, etc., because that prepares the ground for abusive relationships. Even a healthy upbringing, particularly in a traditional environment, like a religious environment, a lot of the social rules is based on duty. So while everyone's doing their duty and behaving, then it's all wonderful and protective. But people who've grown up in that environment don't understand how to deal with people who don't do their duty. In other words, you've kind of grown up in a cricket
like Nishani.
Yeah, exactly. You've grown up thinking that the whole world's a cricket match, and suddenly you find yourself in a rugby scrum, and you don't know what's hit you, because you don't know why people are playing dirty suddenly. You know?
So finding your voice and being able to express your feelings and your needs is really paramount in any relationship.
Absolutely.
In any relationship.
And for me, that's what's important also, to teach children a vocabulary for their needs and feelings, by actually helping them to identify what they're feeling. So if they're not naughty, for example, if you say, I can see you're really frustrated and you really want that ice cream, but you have to wait till supper time. So you can still establish the rule, but at least honor what that child is experiencing and feeling, and help them to name it. So, because if you can name your feelings, you can manage them. If you don't know what you're feeling, then it's easy for someone to gain control over you by telling you what you're feeling.
I think that's another show. I think we need to do a show on teaching our children to find their power at a young age. And then I suppose there's so many people as well who are responding and saying, yes, but children need to respect adults and they need to listen to, and I think that there's so many grey areas there.
Well,
Leonard, many grey areas.
I think that by what I'm talking about is being a leader and being a coach to children. It's not undermining your adult authority. It's actually increasing it. They'll love you and respect you even more. Because they'll see you as a resource. It's just that I believe in respectful relationships, not one up, one down, top dog, underdog power relationships.
Listen, I wanted to talk to you about Mari Engelbrecht.
Annemarie Engelbrecht.
Annemarie Engelbrecht, because you were an expert witness, and we hear of these horrific stories of these murders. There's what's it called? It's intimate infanticide, something like that, where you actually have a partner murdering another partner. Now, perhaps you can just expand on this, because it's in line with what we've been talking about, and also we can just look at the steps that take when that take place when you lose yourself and lose your power in the relationship.
Yes, well, you see, the inspiration behind the approach that I took in that case came from biblical law. There's a biblical law that if someone is threatening your life, you are allowed, if not, you have an obligation to protect your own life. And I realized that a person in an abusive relationship, especially a woman who's been completely isolated, whose power's been taken away, who's tried every legal means to escape, and the law and the police and everything has failed her, can reasonably assume that her life is in actual danger, and therefore she has an obligation to protect herself and her child.
Because, of course, in this case, she killed her abusive husband.
Well, you see, the problem with this case is that the law of self-defense is that the threat has to be immediate, and the force you use has to be in proportion to the force used against you. In this case, he was passed out drunk. She tied a plastic bag over his head, smoked cigarettes and drank coffee for a couple of hours, and then asked a friend to help her to dispose of the body. So there's no precedent in the world for that being considered self-defense. And in fact, the court found her guilty of premeditated murder, because the court, I think, would love to have acquitted her, but there was no choice but to find her guilty of premeditated murder. But the court said because there are exceptional, compelling circumstances to view this differently, she was sentenced to detention until the rising of the court, which meant as soon as the judge rose, the clerk said, "You've served your sentence, the court's risen, you're free to go." Because there was an acknowledgement that she, in a sense, had no choice. And, you know, when you're dealing with a guy who's a 120-kilogram boxer and you're a 70-kilogram woman, and you're being locked up, like Nishani said, you're locked up in your flat, your cell phone's confiscated, you're being kept under surveillance, followed around, intimidated and threatened. You have very little choice. And in this case, which is exactly the same as Nishani, the turning point was when she perceived her child as being under threat. And often women in abusive relationships only recognize their own abuse when they can see that dynamic transferred to their child. And then they also realize that it's not just about them, because the child is someone who the father might love a lot, but is treating the same way nevertheless. And of course then there's also the maternal instinct to protect the child. And what you can see is that a woman in an abusive relationship is so fearful of claiming her own power and entitlement, because the shame and humiliation and all those disempowering, disenfranchising practices have led her to believe that she doesn't have any entitlement or power. But when it comes to using that power and that entitlement to protect your child, then all of a sudden it becomes a simpler matter for them.
So Anna Marie Engelbrecht was abused herself. I mean, her father abused her.
That's right.
So she grew up thinking it was quite normal.
No, she didn't. Not at all. You see, I reject any view that blames the victim. So in actual fact, she vowed when she had her child that she will never allow anyone to abuse her child. And of course,
to abuse her child.
And of course, you know, one of the things the prosecutor asked me is, you know, the relationship was fine at the beginning, just like Devashni was saying, you know. And I said, of course, no one ever knocks on your front door and says, "Hello, I'd like to take you out. Do you want to be in an abusive relationship with me?" It always starts out good, and it always changes subtly. And what changes in an abusive relationship is the power balance. It's the politics of the relationship. So someone's nasty to you, and then immediately they're charming. And what does a woman say? "I'm overreacting, I'm too sensitive. Look, he's really such a nice guy." You see what you want to see, because no one wants to believe that they're trapped with a monster. So you think you'll be able to change it, especially because, you know, the profile of a highly successful woman in an abusive relationship has been standard in my practice. Professors, chair people of organizations preventing women and child abuse, rape crisis counselors, people who you'd never dream would be in abusive relationships. And of course, when you're in that position, the fear of admitting, the humiliation to admit to anybody. So you've got to stay to kind of prove that you're competent and capable to get it right. So this is how the politics shifts very, very subtly until the person realizes that they've just lost too much ground and they're up against too much and they're isolated and they're financially disempowered. I mean, in Anna Marie's case, the husband had a garnishee order on her salary. So she was working as a nurse during the day and doing admin at night, working a night shift, using stimulants to stay awake, just to try and cope financially with what was largely his debt. And so that's a form of slavery. That's like keeping someone so enslaved worrying about their basic survival of just getting up in the morning and getting to work and holding your life together, that they haven't got the capacity to think of big things like, you know, what position am I in my life? Should I be going through this? And what do I do about it?
So she eventually decided to take action when he became abusive towards their daughter.
Yes, that was the trigger.
And she planned this murder, and she killed him. And she was found guilty for premeditated.
So I don't know if she planned it, but she did have cuffs that she'd bought in the morning, and she did, you know, put a it wasn't a spontaneous act of passion.
Which, as you say, which is why you were looking at the self-defense. And she only served for 5 minutes.
Yes,
and that was it. And that case must have had a huge impact on cases all over the world, Leonard.
I don't know about all over the world, but certainly, if you look at the cases here, like the Ferreira case, Anita Ferreira, she would have got off. She would never have gone to jail on a defense like this, you know. And in fact, in this case, the judge even apologized to Anna Marie for the time she'd spent in jail awaiting, you know, for the bail, etc. So certainly, what was important for me about this case is that men often get off with impunity. You know, the police identify with them. The arresting officer was asked, "Have you ever seen this woman before?" And he said, "Yes, he once saw her black and blue walking in the streets disorientated." We had 10111 recordings of her begging the police to help her and saying that he's going to kill her.
She had no support.
She tried to get divorced. The family advocate at the time, this was years ago, the family advocate were late with their report when she phoned them after 6 months. They just shouted at her. She tried every reasonable means to escape. A magistrate, who she tried to get a protection order from, a female magistrate, said, "I think the two of you need to go and sort out your differences over a nice cup of coffee." So people minimized what she was going through. There was no support. So the question is, was she supposed to wait until she was murdered or her child was murdered?
Do you know anything about her now? I mean,
no,
what's happened with her life now?
I don't know.
How does someone come back from something like that? I mean, speaking to Nishani, and it was very bad in her relationship, and she's moving forward, and she had this coach to help her through. To go through a trauma like that, and to defend your child, and to defend your life, and to have to go to that place, how does one return to normality?
The truth of the matter is that not everybody chooses to live a conscious, examined life. So some people go through experiences that can be massively life-changing, and when it's over, they actually just go back to life as normal, as if nothing really happened. So I think it's the rare exceptions who really not only examine what happened to them, but through the examination, they convert all that pain and all that negative experience into wisdom, into gold. Because wisdom really is processed pain.
Leonard, we started off, you spoke about it being at this power. It's a power relationship, and it could be something as subtle as, "I don't like what you're wearing, please don't wear that again." And if we had to summarize, because Nishani turned around and she said, "If I look back now, I know exactly when I would have left." And in hindsight, we can see things very clearly. But for those people who are listening right now, who are not happy in a relationship, it doesn't feel right, maybe they have lost a part of themselves, what should they be looking out for? What are telltale signs?
A telltale sign is if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, if you're fearful, if you start second guessing yourself about what you should be doing or what you should be saying, if you feel threatened, those are the telltale.
Do you walk away or do you work on it?
Well, I would say that you need to talk to other people. The biggest thing, and Nishani highlighted it very well, you have to get support. You can't do it on your own. Abusers know that. That's why they isolate you in the first place. So you actually need to enlist support, and you have to realize that standing up for yourself and admitting that you're in a situation that you're powerless to conquer is ennobling. It's not degrading. And you've got to feel proud of the fact that you can stand up and admit that you need help and you need support, and open yourself to it.
Leonard, thank you so much. It's really been great having you on the show, and hopefully we're going to be on again. I think teaching our children to find their voice at a young age is so, so important. So thanks, Leonard. It's been great. Leonard Carr, clinical psychologist here on Conversations with Niki. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you have enjoyed the show. If you did miss out part of the show, do visit the website www.conversationswithniki, Niki spelled NIKI.co.za. You can get the podcast there. Until next week, take care of yourself. Goodbye.
Hi, my name is Prinsloo, and I'm the HOD of IT integration at Bridwin Preparatory School in Melrose. We started using study apps about 6 months ago and have seen astonishing results. We were quite amazed to see how quickly the kids have been able to use study apps and the benefits it has shown with regards to reinforcing what they've already learned inside the classroom. I would highly recommend study apps for any school.
Studyapps.co.za. Conversations with Niki was brought to you by Studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets.